So without further ado, I'm excited to welcome all of our speakers. Nah Hammond from Funders for LGBTQ Issues, Christy Andrasky from the Cleveland Foundation, and Louise Vivaldi from Foundation for a Just Society. Thank you so much for your time and for all you've put together to make this webinar happen today. I am really excited to see what you have put together for us, and I'm going to turn the slides over to Nah at this point.
Great, thank you, Biz, and thank you, everyone. I am about to start the show. Again, my name is Nah Hammond, and I'm with Funders for LGBTQ Issues. And I'm so pleased today to join this conversation. We're really excited that EPIP has asked us to join the webinar to talk about philanthropic advocacy and what we can all do from wherever we sit within the sector of philanthropy. I'm actually new to philanthropy and an EPIP member myself. And before coming to philanthropy, I was actually working in community organizing and grassroots fundraising for LGBT communities focused on racial justice and economic justice. So this issue is definitely near and dear to my heart, and I'm really excited to share some of the latest research from Funders for LGBTQ Issues with you today. So just before we begin, in case anyone is not familiar with Funders for LGBTQ Issues, we're actually a network of foundations that care about LGBT issues and are committed to intentionally increasing the amount of philanthropic dollars moving towards LGBT communities. So we work side by side with grantmakers and do a variety of strategies in order to increase grantmaking, including convening and providing education to funders, outreaching to new funders in the field. And then one of the core things that we do here is provide research and data on LGBT grantmaking trends every year in our annual tracking report. So our latest one came out last week. The 2014 tracking report was released, and I'm really excited to share some of the top level highlights, and you can download the report from our website as well. Go to the next slide.
No, the slides look great. I just want to make sure that you know the version that we're seeing also includes the next slide. So.
Oh, great. Let's see if I can change that.
Cool. In the meantime, I'll run the poll.
Great.
Now put together a poll for us just to get a sense of how your foundation supports LGBTQ issues. So if you can take a moment to fill in, and you can click as many of these as you'd like, as many as are relevant. So please take a moment to answer, how does your foundation support LGBTQ issues? Great. I'm going to just leave it open for about 5 more seconds if anyone who hasn't voted wants to take a second to share your response. All right, thanks. So here are the results.
Great. So we see that about 56% of us on the call today make some LGBT-specific grants. About 44% LGBT issues are a core part of our grant-making strategies. And then there's a little bit of a split between people who work at institutions that are open to making grants but haven't yet, and institutions where there's no discussion of LGBT issues at their foundation. Biz, please let me know if you can see just one slide right now. Otherwise, I will fix that before moving on.
Yes, we can see one slide. Thanks.
Great, awesome.
We can also see the sidebar with like the list of slides.
Great. So I'm going to try moving on. Sorry for the technical difficulties. Our next slide, having a bit of an issue. Biz, actually, it might be easier if you want to move to the next slide.
Okay, 1 second, I'll pull them up.
Thank you. Apologies for this delay. So actually, the next slide that I'm about to show is a really fantastic chart that shows LGBT grantmaking over the past 40 years, and hopefully it'll come on the screen in a second. And what I really love about the chart is that it shows grantmaking has increased over the past 40 years, and there we go, great. Thanks. So if you go back a slide, that slide, the chart for the past 40 years. There we go. So grantmaking since 1973 has really increased for LGBT communities and issues. In the 1970s, you can see that we received almost no funding for LGBT issues. And then where we see spikes of grant-making increases, that is really to do with a lot of dedicated philanthropic advocacy efforts by individuals in philanthropy working really hard to ensure that philanthropy was addressing the myriad issues that LGBT communities faced. So in 1982, Funders for LGBTQ Issues was actually started by a small group of funders who wanted to bring attention and awareness to LGBT issues in philanthropy. In the 1990s and 2000, where we see some other spikes, we see that really being because of LGBT donors themselves starting private foundations supporting LGBT issues, namely the Gill Foundation and Arcus Foundation, and then that spilling over and having a very influential effect in encouraging other grant makers to support LGBT issues. And then when we zoom forward to today, to 2014, which is the latest year for which we have data available, we see that LGBT grantmaking reached about 153.2 million, which is the largest it's ever been before, and this increase was almost a 19% increase from the year before. However, this isn't all a rosy story. Despite the fact that LGBT communities are receiving almost 153.2 million, what we know is that this is a very small fraction of what overall philanthropy gives every year. So of the $54 billion that philanthropy awards each year, LGBT communities only receive about 28 cents for each $100 that foundations award. Next slide. So this chart actually shows the sources of funding for LGBT issues that we saw in 2014. And what we were seeing is that all the funding really comes from a small set of really committed funders. And despite the fact that we did one of the largest and most comprehensive research surveys we've ever done at Funders for LGBTQ Issues, we actually had a 5-year low in the number of foundations that we found who were actually explicitly supporting LGBT issues, with only about 313 funders that we could find that were supporting LGBT issues. So the top pie chart shows that the top 10 funders, which are listed below, actually provide almost 50% of all grant making from US foundations to LGBT communities. And the top 25 funders actually provide about almost 70% of all grant making to LGBT issues. So we know that this picture represents a pretty top-heavy picture, and we really have a lot of work to do to bring other funders into supporting LGBT communities. Next slide. So this slide represents a new analysis that we've actually done at Funders for LGBTQ Issues, and it's the first year that we've ever done it. We actually surveyed 100 of the largest foundations in the US to see whether they're making LGBT grants. And we did this because we know that a significant portion of all philanthropic dollars come from the largest foundations. They're definitely trendsetters and very influential in the field. So we wanted to get a sense of who was already making grants to LGBT communities. And in our analysis, we actually found that of that 100, 62 out of them were making no LGBT grants whatsoever. And then of the 38 that were making LGBT grants, only about 33 were providing less than 1% of their total grant making to LGBT issues, and only 5 of that top 100 list were providing more than 1% of their total grant making to LGBT issues. So collectively, all of these funders awarded about $35 million, and we knew that if each of these funders were to even increase their grant making by 1%, we could almost double all of the dollars that go to LGBT communities around the world from U.S. foundations. Next slide. So just looking at who is actually funding LGBT issues, I wanted to show you a chart of how we're seeing it break down by funder type. Quickly looking at this breakdown, we saw that private foundations still award the largest share of grant dollars, about 49%. Community foundations are there at 4%, anonymous at 100, and public foundations as well. And a third came from LGBT donors themselves, whether that was LGBT public foundations or LGBT private foundations with a specific focus on LGBT issues. And that we definitely see that even though LGBT grantmakers are have an important role to play, so do people, foundations that are non-LGBT focused in nature, because non-LGBT foundations provide about 56% of overall grant making. Next slide. So I wanted to give a sense of where we're seeing the money going. So in 2014, this chart actually contrasts overall foundation grant making with funding for LGBT issues specifically. So in the blue, we have overall, and then in the maroon color, we have LGBT grant making. So looking at the blue, overall philanthropy tends to focus on health, education, and human services. But when we contrast it with LGBT grantmaking, there's a lot more funding for issues such as civil rights and human rights, which if you add the two first columns together, LGBT funding for civil and human rights is almost 42%, followed next by health with about 24%. So LGBT donors historically have tended to be focused a lot on advocacy issues, civil rights issues, and really changing the conditions that are affecting LGBT communities in contrast with general philanthropy. Next slide. Great. So there were some really exciting increases that we saw in 2014, including increases in funding for specific issues and populations that I'd love to share with you. So in 2014, it was a record year for funding for HIV/AIDS, focused specifically on LGBT communities. We had about $14.9 million awarded to projects, programs, and organizations that were working on HIV/AIDS within the LGBT community. This was almost a 94% increase. That same year, we also saw increases in the issues of criminalization and criminal justice reform, with a lot of almost 107% increase in funding between 2013 and 2014 for that issue, as more LGBT groups are working on the issues of criminal justice reform, on issues of criminalization such as policing, incarceration, et cetera. And then also, we saw promising increases in funding for transgender communities. In 1 year, funding went from $8 million to about $13 million in 2014. So these are very promising increases that we're seeing. These have historically been lower funded issues and populations, so we're excited to see this increase. Next slide. However, at the same time, even though we have seen a huge increase in overall LGBT grant making, there were some issues and areas that actually received less funding and received quite a stark decline from the year before. We actually saw that funding that was specifically targeted and focused on LGBT communities of color went down about $1 million, and funding that was focused on supporting LGBT youth and children went down as well, quite a dramatic drop of $3 million. So now funding for LGBT youth is about $22 million. And in the same period, we also, one of the charts that we have in our tracking report is a a chart that shows local and statewide funding for LGBT issues by state, which you can see on your screen. And I'm just contrasting 2013 with 2014, because what we actually saw was that half the states and DC actually saw decreases in funding for LGBT issues in that time period. And significantly, we saw funding for the Midwest go down about 10%, and funding for the Northeast, which has historically been the highest funded region, go down about 8%. So I'm going to end there, but what I want to say before moving on to our other amazing speakers is that a lot of times we get asked by people who work at foundations or at philanthropic infrastructure organizations, well, what can I do? How can I get involved? And how can I learn more about LGBT issues? And there are really, I think, three things that I'd love to share. The first is that information is definitely power. At Funders for LGBTQ Issues, we're constantly generating reports. You can see some of them on the screen. The 2014 tracking report is a very in-depth report that goes through issues, strategies funded, regions, populations, and it comes out every year, so definitely check out that on our website. We also provide infographics and special reports for funders who are concerned about other issues, for example, immigration or health issues or funding by region, for example, in the South, but want to see how that intersects with LGBT issues and how they could be making a greater impact. So all of that information is on our report, but I definitely encourage everyone to reach out to us at any time and feel free to ask us if you want to learn more or you want to help us to think through how to incorporate LGBT issues into your strategies or connect you with other peers. One of the things that we help to do sometimes is also connect funders who are interested in thinking about LGBT issues with potential organizations in their area or priorities. And then lastly, we always say don't forget the small but significant action steps that you yourself can take at your institution. We definitely recommend for anyone who works at a foundation to look internally and to see where, if your foundation is an equal opportunity employer, that your HR policies actually cover sexual orientation and gender identity. Because we know that in many states, in 30 states across the US, you can be fired for being LGBTQ. So that's an important step that many funders can take in really encouraging more LGBT people to enter the field of philanthropy. And then it's also something you can encourage your grantees to do as well. We've seen a lot of funders who don't necessarily fund in LGBT issues, but they require that their grantees have protections for workers who are LGBT, and that's a wonderful step you can take. That's small, that doesn't have to include dollars as well. So I'll end there and see if any questions came up during the presentation.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. We had two questions. The first is either how much grant making is focused on LGBTQ issues? You said something to the effect of 0.28, maybe 28% or 28 cents on the dollar. Could you help clarify that?
Yeah, great question. So I was saying for every $100 that foundations award, about 28% goes to LGBT issues, and that's 0.28% of all foundation funding. I hope that clarifies it.
Great, thank you. And the second question is, I work specifically in the space of education funding. We do not currently fund anything in the LGBTQ space. What do you think people working in education funding can do to support this group?
Yeah, that is such a great question. I think that a lot of education funders, we currently track quite a few education funders who support LGBT issues. Definitely, I would recommend reading our reports. I think that we're going to hear from two wonderful funders at the end of this call who can maybe chime in as well. But I think raising the conversation and with your peers and your colleagues about how to support LGBT issues and making sure that when you're talking about communities that are maybe affected by your grant-making strategies, that you're also bringing in the conversation about, well, what about LGBT youth or children, or how does LGBT issues intersect with education issues? I think constantly raising the question is a really important first step that you can take, and really helping your institution or other peer institutions recognize not to leave people out. And then also, please reach out to us at Funders for LGBTQ Issues. We also provide a lot of research strategies, and we can help you think through if you have specific challenges that you're facing or ways you'd like to start bringing that conversation to the networks you're part of.
Great, thank you. So next we're going to turn the mic over to Louise. You should all be able to see the slideshow on the screen now. We're going to loop back on more questions at the end. So thank you all for continuing to send in your questions. And Louise, it's your turn.
Thank you, and hello everyone. So my name is Louise Vivaldi. I'm the Program Associate here at the Foundation for a Just Society. So quickly, I want to just thank EPIP really for organizing this conversation, and also to thank all of you for participating. So a little bit about myself, and then I'll jump into FJS and our history and work. So if you could just switch to the next slide, please. Liz, next slide, please. Thank you. So really, like many of you, I kind of got involved in this work because I wanted to make a difference in the lives of others. And also growing up bicultural and gay in a rural East Texas town, it wasn't entirely altruistic. You know, I wanted a just world for myself as well. So I got involved in Foundation Philanthropy pretty early on and had been involved for like the last 7 years, and recently got back from a Peace Corps tour as a volunteer in Albania, where I really was able to get involved in LGBTI work. And it's really that experience, both the work experience and simply living, learning, have been able to learn about the depths and the nuances that exist in injustice. It's daunting, it's complicated, so this web of challenges and barriers that really face communities here in the US and around the world that prevent them from accessing and really expressing and exercising their full human rights. So next slide, please. So at Foundation for a Just Society, it was our board chair and founder, Audra Simon, who kind of saw these same complicated issues and felt called to action with a really simple but ambitious vision of creating a world without discrimination. So in 2011, she brought together a board of dedicated women and formed FJS. And in those first years, set an agenda to learn about the field, meeting with funders, nonprofit organizations, and experts. All the while, the board asking themselves, where is the greatest need? What is the root cause of that need or creating that need? Where is there the greatest capacity for change, and where can we as a foundation have the most impact and create a difference? So in their learning, they really saw a lack of support for women, girls, and LGBTI human rights, and specifically a lack of women-led, youth-led, and LGBTI-led organizations. They recognize also that gender-based discrimination intersects with all aspects of a person's identity and the circumstances of the lives they live and the barriers, again, that prevent them from living a life of fully expressed human rights and opportunity. So to start creating that cultural change and social change, and start building movements and lifting up the voices of women and to create real and lasting change, they felt they had to tackle those root causes that were preventing women, or causing women to be marginalized, and really empower them and connect them to one another. So next slide, please. So FJS is born, and how we do our work is really centered around four key pillars of our theory of change. But first off is really about naming the issue and naming and putting women, girls, and LGBTI people at the front of our work. So, and that even includes not only in our work, but also how we work here in the office and, and have inclusive policies and facilities for all people. So finally, so secondly, our theory of change, as you can see, continuously honing in those areas of direct grant making, leadership in philanthropy, strategic communications, and capacity building to really build this infrastructure of women, girls, and LGBTI movements. I'm going to focus on direct grant making, through which we provide multi-year general operating grants and support and partner with organizations whose visions of realizing women's and LGBTI rights cuts across multiple issues. So it's talking about long-term sustained support for groups that are working on the ground across issues, be it education, reproductive justice, racial justice, economic empowerment, etc. And supporting grassroots organizations, networks, regional and international funds, and other groups that are, again, in the same vision of supporting women's, girls, and LGBTI rights. Our vision is to create a cohort of long-term grantees working on a range of issues with a broad frame of gender justice, and are using a diversity of approaches to achieve that goal. So to create real social and cultural change. Next slide, please. So one example of a group that we've been working with is Quain, which is the Queer African Youth Network. Quain was established in 2010 to build a regional movement for LGBTQ rights in Francophone West Africa, led by women and young people. And we began working with them in 2012. And in that time, as you can see from the slide, some examples of the things that they've been able to accomplish: creating a safe space for LGBTQ people in Burkina Faso, mobilizing additional resources to the LGBTQ advocacy in the region, and then strengthening the leadership of queer and trans people. Next slide, please. So in preparation for this conversation, and the three of us were talking, and Na put a good question about, how work like what LGBT funders or funders for LGBTQ issues, and for example the tracking report, how is helpful for our organizations. And for us, I feel like it's very relevant in three ways. One, it helps us to understand our work in relationship to the field and communicate that with our board and our partners. So for example, from the slide, you can see how our own philanthropic giving has increased over the last 5 years. And kind of based on the report, in 2014, we supported 57 grants for 7.3 million. And so 1.36 million of that supported LGBTQ issues. That's about 18% of our grant making. So kind of flipping through the report earlier this week, it was really exciting to see FJS listed in the top 10 of non-LGBTQ private foundations. So secondly, using this report, it really supports our own leadership in philanthropy, which from our slide on theory of change you saw is one of our 4th pillars about how we in turn can, through our work, push the conversation on women, girls, and LGBTI rights and issues. So by knowing where other funders are working and what they're supporting, it really opens up opportunities for collaboration and for partnership. Also, it highlights the gaps in the funding and where we can, through our support, make a difference and in turn communicate to others the need to join us and fill those gaps. And so for one example, using this report along with much other research and study, we're really able to make a case to support in the US Southeast, which is one of our focus regions, as well as for FJS to become a fund member of the LGBTQ Racial Justice Fund, which is a collaborative funding venture, and the first fund of its type really to focus specifically on that intersection of LGBTQ rights and racial justice. That collaborative funds organizations addressing root causes for LGBTQ people of color across a number of intersecting campaign issues in the US Southeast. which has been seriously underfunded. So the next slide, please. So the work that we do and the changes we want to see really are about creating real change for women, girls, and LGBTI people. And it's about empowering and raising the voices of those most marginalized and supporting them to come together in this vision of a just world free of discrimination. So this kind of work is, as I've said, long-term. It requires risk and trust and commitment. And it's not easy, but change can happen. And through the example of Quain and others, it is happening. So quickly, I want to thank you, and I'll see if there's any questions from others. Also, feel free to continue to connect with us and learn more about our work through our social media and websites.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you, everyone, for your patience with the technical difficulties today, but the content in these slides are beautiful, so thank you all for putting them together. I'm going to leave up this slide for a moment while I see if any folks have specific questions for Louise and his work at FJS before we turn the mic over to Christy. I have a question while we wait to see if anything else comes up. You talked about the collaboration, the Racial Justice Initiative, I think you said it was called. I'm curious if you could just say a couple words about how that began and how funders joined, just to give an example of ways perhaps some funders on the call might think about collaborating on that type of model.
Yeah, so the LGBTQ Racial Justice Fund is currently housed at Estrella Foundation, and partner foundations include FJS, Arcus, Calamus, and a number of others, Ford Foundation, and others that are escaping me currently. There is a website which recently became live, so if you just type in LGBTQ Racial Justice Fund, you'll be able to Google it quickly. It's a relatively new collaborative. It's been about 2 years in operation, and really that first year was about really setting the goals of the work and really wanting to focus on at one point on the Southeast because of the definite need there. Although there is the hope to grow that and expand it, recognizing the crossover of LGBTQ and racial justice issues outside of the Southeast, but that's currently where our funding lies. And also about supporting collaboration and community organizing of organizations to really build campaigns to campaign on different issues, be it wrongful treatment of trans people on the street, also crossing over with immigration rights issues and knowing our rights, etc. So to get involved, I would highly recommend going to, again, that website, LGBTQ Racial Justice Fund, to learn more about it, to learn more about the work of the groups going on, and to connect with us.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Christy now.
Great. All right, let's see if we can get these slides going.
Great.
All right. Everything look good?
That's good.
Cool. So thanks for hanging in, everybody. Hello to you. I'm Christy Graczyk. I'm a program officer at the Cleveland Foundation. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about what it's like to be engaged in queer philanthropy in a region where we don't usually say the word queer very much. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what that journey's been like for me. So first, just some background on the Cleveland Foundation, in case you haven't heard of us. So Cleveland Foundation is actually the world's first community foundation. So we've been around for about 102 years now. We are still one of the largest community foundations with $2.2 billion in assets. And our grant making in 2014 totaled out at $98 million for the year. We have a mix of strategies that we use. We have some board-directed strategies, which are more proactive in nature. We have responsive grant making, and then, of course, we have some donor-designated or donor-advised type funds. our grants are a wide range. We have small grants from under $5,000 to grants that top out over $1 million. And we are really a place-based funder. By design, by nature, legally, we are a place-based funder. So our funding goes directly to the greater Cleveland region. And that means that we don't have specific thematic topics because our topic is our region, right? So we support local organizations across a wide variety of sectors. So we might be supporting arts, education, social service, economic and neighborhood revitalization, advocacy and policy efforts. And that means we're also supporting some really small organizations and some really big organizations. So Queer in Cleveland. So a couple little facts for you. We are home to the nation's third oldest LGBT community center, which last year celebrated its 40th birthday. We are situated in a state that does not have protections from discrimination in housing, employment, and public accommodations. We're one of those many states in the country that does not have any protections. Some of our municipalities do have protections. I'll talk about that in a second. Prior to last year's ruling, Ohio also not only did not have marriage equality, but we had a superdoma. So that posed a whole bunch of extra work for our advocacy organizations. And as you may be familiar with, the Jim Obergefell case that actually went to the Supreme Court did come from Ohio. And finally, in the city of Cleveland, we do have some ordinances that protect against discrimination in public accommodations for our LGBT community. However, there was specific carve-outs that happened that accept gender identity and expression from those public accommodations non-discrim protections. So that has been something that our advocacy organizations have been working very hard on as well. All right, so then this happened. The gay games, which you may or may not have heard of, have been around for over 30 years. They are the largest international sports and culture festival in the world that are open to all participants regardless of ability, sexual orientation, gender identity expression, disability status, etc. And the gay games have typically been held in places like San Francisco, Chicago, Cologne, Germany. In 2018, they'll be going to Paris. However, in 2009, Cleveland and Akron, our Northeast Ohio region, won a bid to bring the gay games here. So the 2014 gay games were held in the Northeast Ohio region, Cleveland and Akron, Ohio, which brought 20,000 people to our region, which was a pretty cool opportunity. So the Cleveland Foundation, being that we are very place-based in our funding and in our focus, we stepped up. We stepped to the plate. This was a pretty big deal to have something this big coming to our region. I was a new program officer when the discussions started happening about what role we should or should not play in supporting this. And I am very pleased to say that it was very comforting to me that I found myself working in a foundation that was not hesitant to support the gay games for any reasons having to do with concerns over should we really be in this space? Do we want to support LGBT populations? The only concerns that were brought up initially were, well, isn't this a sporting event? And what's sort of the impact? Why would we put a lot of dollars into supporting something that is basically a big sporting event? And this is where I think some of the really interesting learning comes in, because it's taking something that you might take for granted as, well, it's just a sporting event, why would a foundation support this? And really educating yourself and doing some education within your foundation to take a deeper dive and look at what is the potential of the impact for this. So by the Cleveland Foundation putting our name behind this, we made a $250,000 grant, which put our name literally in the logo. You can see on the screen there, our name was literally on the logo for the gay games. It was the 2014 gay games presented by the Cleveland Foundation. That gives a lot of legitimacy to this event. That gives a lot of visibility to the LGBT community, and it creates an opportunity for a lot of leverage for other LGBT organizations and just LGBT issues in general to start to get some face time and start to get some conversation in sort of the mainstream. All right, so poll time, which I think Biz is going to take over so you guys can all do a poll. So if you're over there chatting or looking at something else, typing up a document, and you've got this in your background, come back to us, take our poll.
Yes, thank you so much, Christy. Folks, if you can click if many of these are true for you. How prepared do you feel to help your foundation step up its LGBTQ support? If you have a good working knowledge of the issues in your region or the region specific to your funding organization, if you feel like you have good relationships and communication with LGBTQ serving organizations in your region, if you feel like you have the ability to find or use resources related to LGBTQ philanthropy, if you feel like you have comfort discussing LGBTQ issues and that are maybe broad spectrum or also specific to local LGBTQ serving organizations with your colleagues, please check any of those boxes. And if you feel uncomfortable at work, or if you feel like you can barely imagine trying to say or explain what LGBTQ means at work, please go ahead and click that last box. All right, one more second and we're going to close the poll. All right, Kristen.
All right, so let's see. It looks like we've got 70% of folks feel that they have a good working knowledge of current LGBTQ issues impacting their local community. 55% feel that they have good relationships with LGBT organizations. 65% have the ability to find and use resources related to LGBT philanthropy. 70% have a level of comfort discussing LGBT issues and the work of LGBT organizations at their foundation. And no one felt uncomfortable. That's pretty great. All right. All right, so since you all already have a pretty great foundation for working in this space, what do you do to leverage that? How can you really make this happen? So I really want to focus on how you can move intentionally in order to move your foundation. And the first thing, and not made mention of this, that information is power. And that is, I just can't stress that enough. Educating yourself, learning everything you can. If you think that you know everything there is to know about all things LGBT and your world is gay all day, every day, you still don't know enough. You have to keep educating yourself. You need to understand what's going on locally in your landscape. You need to understand what's happening with your organizations. You need to understand nationally. You really have to be the expert to the extent that you possibly can be. And remember that these things are changing constantly. Our landscape is constantly changing. So your knowledge needs to be constantly updated. So you have to really dig in deep with that. You're going to want to build relationships within your foundation, between foundations, and in the community. Those relationships are going to be key. The relationships so that folks feel comfortable talking with you, the relationships so that you have created a safe space in order for folks to participate in this topic with you, and relationships so that folks in the community will tell you what's really going on, so that when you're representing their issues, you're representing them as accurately and authentically as you possibly can be. You're going to want to also get thoughtful about the interplay of your LGBTQ identity and your professional identity. So if you are a member of the LGBT community, take some time for yourself to think about how do you use that or not use that. It is something where you have some intentional use of self and how you can move in the community, gain trust in the community, how you can bring some authenticity to what you're talking about in your foundation and in your work. It's also something where you may not want to, for your own personal reasons, for your own professional reasons, you may not want to dive into or kind of be very visible with your LGBTQ identity, and that's fine too. It's more a matter of you need to kind of think about it, figure out for you how it's going to play in with your professional role and your professional identity. If you're not a member of the LGBT community, that goes for you as well. If you're an ally, how do you identify yourself as an ally? How do you present yourself so that you can move in those spaces and so that people will feel comfortable and have those relationships with you? stay grounded in the reality of the community that you work with. Your experience is your experience. So it does bring a level of authenticity when you can speak to your experience, when you can stand up and say in front of your coworkers and your colleagues, hey, I am a member of the LGBT community and I could be fired for saying that and it would be legal because we have no protections in this state. That is powerful. So that is an important way that you can bring your identity and your experience to play. However, that is not enough because you don't represent everyone in the LGBT community, and that's what goes back to that knowledge of educating yourself and those relationships so that you can truly understand what's going on for the full community and represent to the best of your ability. Find a support network for yourself. You're going to need it. This is tiring work. You're going to be working really hard if you're going to dive into this, and you need some folks, coworkers, you need some folks in your professional space, and you need some folks outside of your professional space who you can bounce ideas off of, who you can speak candidly with, who you can vent to, you can strategize with. You're going to need that support in order to sustain yourself to really do this work. So a couple of other things to think about. Identify the language and the norms that are the culture of your foundation. Work within that culture, not against it. So if saying queer is not something that happens in your foundation and you can just see your entire boardroom of folks passing out of a heart attack as soon as you say that out loud, don't jump to that. Don't start using that terminology. Work within your culture and move slowly and intentionally and strategically to get folks comfortable with terminology. Use the terminology that they're using and then maybe just add a couple things in here and there. Talk about the LGBT community as a marginalized population. If your foundation works with marginalized populations on behalf of marginalized people, go with that terminology. Go with where your foundation already is. Use questions intentionally. So wherever you are, just ask the question, how does this reach out to LGBT people? How does this serve LGBT people? How does this impact LGBT health equity issues? Ask questions to get others thinking about it in a way that is not necessarily putting people on the defensive and just getting folks to start to get curious with you. Not everyone's going to have a gay games coming to their area, but if there is a catalyst, if there's something going on in your community that you can build on, go with that. You're going to want to partner, definitely partner. You want to find those other partners outside of your foundation that are related to your sector as well as across the sector. Because those partnerships, when you do some programs together, when you do some workshops, et cetera, together, you're going to start to build this sense of legitimacy for this topic. You're going to pique folks' interest in this topic. Chronicle your successes, however small they are. This is very nuanced work. It's slow. It doesn't happen quickly. The best example that I can give is that documentaries and fiction films are both great when you go watch them in the theater. They can be powerful, they can be moving, they can be exciting. But the process of writing them is not the same. A documentary is something that happens slowly, and you don't always see what the end is going to look like or that there's going to be something powerful and exciting. When you're in it, it's slow, it's nuanced, it can be sometimes painful, but that's what you're doing with this work. You're writing a documentary. Okay, so basically I just told you all that this work's going to be slow, it's going to be painful, it's going to add extra hours to your work week, and it might kill your soul just a little tiny bit. So why would you want to do this? Well, I'll tell you why it was worth it for me. After we announced the $250,000 grant to the Gay Games, we didn't stop there. I went out, I met with a whole bunch of LGBT organizations. I cultivated relationships with them. I learned about their needs, about what was going on in the community, and made sure that they felt they had a comfortable connection in with the foundation and could come to us for the support they needed to build their capacity. So in addition to that $250,000, we provided another $250,000 in additional grants to the organizations that you see there. Partnerships. These are the ways that some of these tenets that I've laid out for you have come to play in my work and how they can hopefully come to play in your work. Partnership is really important. Early on, the Foundation Center, which has an office in Cleveland, reached out to me about a program that they were putting on called Rising Tide Lifts LGBTQ Issues. It was very timely. It was the spring before the Gay Games, and they wanted to put on this program to really highlight the landscape of LGBT issues in Cleveland. Fantastic. This was a ton of work. It was a labor of love, but I can say it was unbelievably powerful and continues to have a ripple effect today as we speak. Visibility matters. From that workshop, we had the Cleveland Magazine, which is our sort of regional magazine that goes out to the homes of suburban folks all over. They decided they were going to do an issue about LGBT Cleveland in time for the gay games, and much of the material that they pulled was from that Rising Tide program that the Foundation Center put on. Inside of that issue of that magazine, there was full-page color photos of a trans teen, of a trans man and his wife, of LGBT families that had all been identified through that Rising Tide program. So the ripple effect is significant. There was panel discussions that have occurred. There have been art shows that have opened. Intentionality matters. Those rainbow flags that you see didn't get there by accident. Those got put up at in one of the Cleveland neighborhoods in time for the gay games. That was a result of a grant that was made to an umbrella organization that works with many of our neighborhoods in Cleveland, and we provided some funding for them to work with those neighborhoods and offer those neighborhoods some marketing dollars so the neighborhoods could put up rainbow flags, they could do promotional activities, etc. But they could only get those marketing dollars to do those things if they went through a cultural competency training to make sure that their businesses were actually ready to truly be welcoming to all the LGBT folks that were going to be coming to Cleveland. Leverage matters. I wish that the Cleveland Foundation could take credit for the huge donation that our LGBT Center received, but that did not come from us. However, the Cleveland Foundation did provide the LGBT Center smaller grant dollars to do a facility feasibility study to get ready to find out if they were, what position were they in to move, to buy a new place, to rent a new place, etc. Some capacity building to put in some communication staff, etc. to be ready for what ended up being the largest donation in their history, and the LGBT Center is now getting ready to purchase and move into their own location. We provided some capacity building dollars to our Equality Ohio, our local advocacy, statewide advocacy organization, and that capacity building gave them the staff and the on-the-ground presence to be able to put together marketing and fundraising materials like the ones that you see here to really help them message and tell their story so that they could become more sustainable. And finally, funding matters. That's what we're all here for, right? The funding actually matters. This is a grant that I'm overly thrilled with to share with folks that we made to this organization called the Housing Research and Advocacy Center. Another organization that came to the Rising Tide event called me up afterwards and said, hey, this is something we have been thinking about and trying to work on for a while. Can you help us? Since LGBT folks are not protected federally under non-discrimination in housing, there also is no federal funds to investigate whether that discrimination is happening, which means this organization could not legally use any of their federal funding or public dollars to investigate, to educate, or to litigate in cases of housing discrimination. So the Cleveland Foundation was able to provide them a grant to do that research and come out with a report letting us know the state of things in our Ohio area with housing. And I know we're running right up against the edge of our time, and I'm so sorry. I just wanted to end my section by saying that this work really does matter and it's worth it.
Thank you so much, Christy. I think there's a lot of great lessons for folks. Definitely point back to some of the questions in your slides. So thank you for sharing all of that knowledge and also the stories that it comes from. We do have a couple questions. I think because we are up against the hour that I'll just first say, if you have joined the call and you need to go at 4 o'clock, we totally understand. The recording will be available online on the EPIP website by the end of the week. And the slides from all of our presenters will also be there, along with ways to get more information, check out the resources they've referenced, and ways for you to continue to connect with them around these key questions. For anyone who can stay on the line, please go ahead and share your questions into the question box, either specifically for Christy or for the larger panel. I'm going to go ahead and point back to a question that I think you said you wanted to share some thoughts on, Christy, which is this initial question about being a funder in an educational setting and wanting to think about directing more funds to the LGBTQ space. Do you have tips for that individual on the call as to how they can start to help point more educational funding to support the LGBTQ community?
Yeah, I think that the key for any of us really, that whether you're funding in education, whether you're funding in health, et cetera, you don't have to be in a foundation that has an LGBT initiative or has an LGBT fund. The key is to really help highlight to your organization that LGBT people exist everywhere and that LGBT people are a marginalized population. So whatever you're doing with education funding, health funding, funding for seniors, et cetera, that's where that educating yourselves on. So what are the education issues that specifically or disproportionately impact LGBT folks? And then bringing that to not only the intention of your foundation, but also the grantees and the organizations that you work with by asking them those questions when they come in and they have some great program that they want you to fund, asking them those questions. So how does this impact LGBT youth? Are you aware of this? Sharing resources with them, kind of doing some technical assistance to help them be more intentional and how they address the needs specifically of LGBT youth in their programming.
Great, thank you. I'm going to also point to the next question, but all of our presenters, I hope if you would like to give feedback on this question, you can. I guess this one is specifically for you, Na, looking at it more closely. Is the funding analysis broken down by the alphabet, i.e. how much went to bisexual issues? And this participant wants to wish everybody a happy Bisexual Month as part of the question. So Na, how is the analysis that you guys did related to each of the different letters in the acronym?
Thanks, Bez. Yes, happy Bisexual Health Awareness Month, everyone. Yes, definitely, yes. Our analysis actually does break down funding for different segments of the LGBT population, as well as different communities within the LGBT population. So, for example, funding for communities of color, funding for intersex communities, funding for children and youth. So we go very detailed into a lot of specific funding for subpopulations. But to answer your question, funding for bisexuals historically has been quite low, and last year we actually saw a decrease in funding specifically for projects that were focused on supporting bisexual communities, and bisexual communities receive less than 1% of all LGBT funding.
Wow, definitely going to dig into that report. I think this has been phenomenal. We have another question that points back to some of the large lessons for all of us. So I'm just going to re-articulate that question and as an opportunity for last words from each of our presenters. And if you do have to hop off the line, we understand. Thank you so much for joining. So this last question is, do you have good strategies for linking the work of an LGBTQ fund with other funds within a community foundation?
Yeah, so I think that it goes back a little bit to what I was saying earlier with looking at education funding. So it really is about looking holistically at all of the needs of an LGBT population. I think for so long we've been so focused on very specific things like the marriage issue, et cetera, that sometimes we forget to take a broad look and realize that LGBT folks have employment barriers. LGBT folks have hunger issues. LGBT folks have, issues with health, with disability status, with finding safe spaces for their children, with housing, et cetera. All of the things that we know impact quality of life for any marginalized population impacts LGBT folks. So taking that holistic view and maybe, kind of strategically using some of your LGBT specific funds to supplement some larger grants that you might be doing to make sure that you can kind of move the needle with an organization that might be doing something broadly for mental health, and then you're able to sort of supplement that by saying, let's also make sure that you are intentionally and culturally competently serving the LGBT community with this program.
Great, thank you. And thank you all for joining. This has been a really amazing deep dive into the theory, but also how to bring the theory to life, kind of what's going on the highest level and in very specific places around the globe and in our own backyards. So I hope it's been inspirational for folks. Again, feel free to reach out, biz@epip.org, with any questions. And a last thank you to everyone who's joined today and to our 3 presenters. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.